If you've spent most of your life treating water as the one thing you never have to think twice about, chugging a full glass when you're thirsty, downing a bottle in a few long swallows after a walk, drinking most of your daily water in 2 or 3 big sittings, instead of spreading it out, there's a specific cardiovascular reflex tied to exactly that habit, and it becomes measurably stronger after age 65. This isn't about drinking less water. It's about the way you're drinking it, and there's real published research, going back over 2 decades, showing that the way water enters your body changes how your nervous system and your blood pressure respond to it, especially once you're past 65. This matters for a reason. Most people never connect to a glass of water. Heart and blood pressure problems are almost always framed around food, salt, and exercise, never around the timing or pace of plain water. The one substance everyone assumes is universally, unconditionally safe in any amount and at any speed. That assumption is true for the substance itself. It's the delivery, fast, cold, and concentrated into 1 or 2 large sittings, where the actual science gets more specific than most people have ever heard. A quick note before we go further. This channel is for general education, not medical advice, and I'm not your doctor. Nothing here is a diagnosis or a prescription. If you're managing heart failure, kidney disease, or you're on a fluid restriction or a diuretic prescribed by your doctor, none of this video should be used to change your fluid intake on your own. Always follow your doctor's specific instructions for your situation, and bring anything in this video to them directly, rather than adjusting anything yourself. With that said, let's get into exactly what researchers have found, because this is one of the more genuinely surprising, well-documented findings in cardiovascular research, and almost nobody outside of specialist medical circles has ever heard of it, despite the original study being over 2 decades old at this point. Consider someone like Walter, call him that, a composite of the kind of case this research is built on, not any single real patient. 73 years old, generally healthy, on a low-dose medication for mildly elevated blood pressure that had kept his numbers controlled for years. Walter's habit, like millions of people his age, was simple. He didn't really drink water steadily through the day. He'd go hours without much of anything. Then, especially after a walk or first thing when he woke up, he'd pour a large glass of cold water and drink most of it in under a minute. The way most of us were taught was simply staying hydrated. At a routine appointment, his doctor happened to check his blood pressure twice, once before he'd had anything to drink that morning, and once about 25 minutes after he drank a full glass of water in the waiting room. The second reading was noticeably higher than the first, more than would be explained by waiting room nerves alone. That small, almost accidental observation is exactly the phenomenon this entire video is about, and it's worth saying plainly that Walter never would have connected the 2 readings himself, because nothing about drinking a glass of water in a waiting room feels like the kind of thing that should move a blood pressure number at all. Before we go further, tell me in the comments whether you tend to sip water steadily through the day, or whether you mostly drink it in a few big glasses at a time. The way most of us were raised to believe was simply normal. I read these, and they shape exactly what I cover next. Here's what almost no one explains, and what genuinely surprised the researchers who first discovered it. Drinking water isn't the passive, purely hydrating act most of us assume it is. There's a real, measurable phenomenon called the water pressor response, first described in a landmark study published in the journal Circulation by Dr. Jens Jordan and colleagues at Vanderbilt University. Researchers had healthy older adults and healthy young adults drink about 2 cups of plain tap water, then tracked their blood pressure continuously for over an hour afterward. In the young, healthy participants, almost nothing happened. Blood pressure stayed essentially flat. But in the older participants, systolic blood pressure rose by an average of 11 points within about 20 to 30 minutes and stayed elevated for close to an hour. The researchers also measured norepinephrine, a stress hormone tied to the body's fight-or-flight system, and found it rose by roughly as much as it does after a cup of coffee or a cigarette, meaning your nervous system treats a glass of water, under the right conditions, almost like a mild stimulant. Picture your nervous system as having a dimmer switch that controls how tightly your blood vessels are squeezed at any given moment. In a younger body, that dimmer switch barely moves when water arrives in the stomach. In an older body, water drinking nudges that dimmer noticeably upward, and the effect is large enough that researchers now specifically control for it in blood pressure drug trials. because it's strong enough to skew results if participants happen to drink water at different times before testing. Why does this happen specifically as we age? Researchers believe it comes down to changes in how the autonomic nervous system, the part of your body that runs blood pressure, heart rate, and digestion automatically without you thinking about it, responds to internal signals as it ages. In younger bodies, several overlapping systems buffer and smooth out the response to water entering the stomach, keeping blood pressure essentially level. As those buffering systems become less responsive with age, the underlying reflex, water hitting the stomach and small intestine, triggering a measurable spike in sympathetic nervous system activity, becomes more visible, more unmasked, and more able to actually move your blood pressure number rather than being absorbed quietly in the background the way it was decades earlier. This is exactly why a 25-year-old can chug an entire bottle of water without a second thought, while the same habit produces a real, measurable cardiovascular event in someone 40 years older, even though both people are doing the literal same thing. Researchers have spent years trying to pin down exactly what about water triggers this reflex in the first place, and the honest answer is that it's still somewhat debated, though two leading explanations have emerged, and they likely both play a role. The first is gastric distension, simply the physical stretching of your stomach as it fills, which is known to activate nerve signals that travel directly to the brainstem and influence the autonomic nervous system. The second is osmolality, meaning how dilute or concentrated the water is compared with your bloodstream. A study published in the American Journal of Physiology directly compared the effects of drinking plain water against drinking an identical volume of saline solution, which matches the body's own salt concentration, and found that both triggered a measurable sympathetic response, while suggesting that simple volume and stretching of the stomach play a meaningful role independent of water's diluting effect on the blood. In practical terms, this means the reflex isn't simply about water being too pure or too diluting for your system. It's substantially about sheer volume arriving quickly, which is exactly why the fix isn't switching to a different beverage, but changing the pace and amount at which any beverage arrives. Interestingly, this same reflex that we're discussing as a potential concern has actually been turned into a legitimate medical treatment for a completely different problem. Researchers at Vanderbilt, the same team behind the original circulation study, went on to test water drinking specifically as a treatment for patients who faint or feel severely lightheaded upon standing up, a condition called orthostatic hypotension, common in certain autonomic disorders and to a lesser degree in some older adults generally. In that research, published in the American Journal of Medicine, drinking a glass of water about 20 to 30 minutes before standing for a prolonged period, before church, before a long shower, before a doctor's appointment with a long wait, measurably reduced fainting and severe lightheadedness in vulnerable patients by deliberately using the very same pressor reflex we've been describing to provide a temporary protective boost to blood pressure right when it's needed most. This isn't a contradiction of everything else in this video. It's actually the clearest possible proof that the reflex is real, strong, and medically significant enough to be prescribed on purpose in one context, while being worth managing more carefully as an unintentional daily habit in another. The difference is entirely about whether the response is being used deliberately and occasionally, under medical guidance, or repeated as an unconscious habit multiple times every single day for years. So let's get specific about exactly what drinking water the wrong way actually means, because this isn't an argument against water itself. Water remains essential, and dehydration carries its own well-documented risks for older adults, including confusion, falls, and kidney strain. This is specifically about volume and speed, the size of the dose your body receives at once, and how quickly it arrives. The first piece is large volume gulping rather than steady sipping. In the original circulation study, and in the follow-up research that built on it, the pressor response was triggered by a meaningful volume of water consumed in a short window, roughly 2 cups, consumed over a few minutes, rather than the same amount spread across an hour. Sipping water steadily throughout the day, a few ounces at a time, simply doesn't deliver the same concentrated stimulus to the stomach and small intestine that triggers this sympathetic reflex. Think of it the way a single large wave hits a shoreline differently than the same volume of water arriving as a gentle, steady tide. The structure underneath responds very differently to a sudden surge than to a slow, continuous flow, even when the total amount is identical. For someone over 65, this means the habit of going hours without water and then catching up with 1 or 2 large glasses is exactly the pattern that produces the largest blood pressure spikes, while the same total daily water intake spread into smaller amounts every hour or two produces a far gentler, often unnoticeable response. The second piece is water temperature, and this is the part almost nobody has heard of. A more recent study comparing the cardiovascular response to room temperature water, and cold carbonated water in both younger and older healthy adults found that cold water specifically amplified the pressor response compared with room temperature water, and that this amplification was significantly more pronounced in the older participants than the younger ones. The proposed explanation involves an additional layer on top of the basic water pressor reflex. Cold temperature appears to add its own separate stimulus to the nervous system, on top of the volume-related signal, compounding the blood pressure response rather than simply adding a small extra bump. This doesn't mean a cold glass of water on a hot day is dangerous for the average person, but it does mean that the specific combination of cold and large volume, gulped quickly, stacks 2 separate triggers on top of each other, rather than just one, which is exactly the kind of compounding effect that matters more the older you are and the more cardiovascular risk factors you're already managing. If either of these is sounding like your normal routine, type the word gulper in the comments if that's genuinely you. No judgment. This is an extremely common habit that almost nobody knew how to name until just now. The third piece, and the one most specific to people managing existing heart or blood pressure conditions, involves what's happening underneath this reflex for anyone already on blood pressure medication, a diuretic, or managing heart failure. Several of the most common blood pressure medications, in essentially all diuretics, work by directly influencing the same sympathetic nervous system and fluid balance pathways that the water pressor reflex operates through. For most people on a stable, well-controlled blood pressure medication, an occasional pressor response from a quickly gulped glass of water is a minor, temporary blip that resolves within an hour and causes no lasting harm. But for someone whose blood pressure medication is already working hard to keep their numbers controlled, repeatedly layering an 11-point or higher spike on top of that controlled baseline multiple times a day, every single day, for years, is a meaningfully different pattern than an occasional one-off, the kind of repeated, compounding load that researchers increasingly think about, the same way they think about repeated, small mechanical stress on a joint over decades, rather than a single dramatic injury. This is precisely why researchers flag the pressor response as an important, yet unrecognized confounding factor in blood pressure drug trials. It's strong enough to interfere with how well doctors can actually tell if a medication is working, which tells you something about its real-world significance outside of a research lab too. And it's part of why some clinics now specifically instruct patients to avoid drinking water in the 30 minutes immediately before a blood pressure check, to get a more accurate baseline reading. The fourth piece is a separate but related concern, particularly relevant for anyone managing heart failure or taking a diuretic specifically for fluid control: the balance between total water volume and the sodium and minerals in your bloodstream. This isn't about the pressor reflex anymore. It's about a different, equally real risk called hyponatremia, meaning low blood sodium. Diuretics, particularly the thiazide class commonly prescribed for blood pressure, work in part by removing sodium from your body along with excess fluid. Research on older adults taking these medications has found that when fluid intake stays high while dietary sodium and protein intake are simultaneously low, a combination that's extremely common in people who've also been told to cut back on salt for their blood pressure, creating an unintentional collision between two pieces of well-meaning advice. The kidneys lose some of their ability to properly dilute and excrete that extra water. In that specific combination, some older adults have developed clinically significant low blood sodium, with daily water intake of as little as 1.5 liters, a volume that would be considered completely unremarkable, even slightly low, for almost anyone else. The reason this matters specifically for the heart, Sodium plays a direct role in how your heart's electrical signaling works, and significant drops in blood sodium can produce symptoms ranging from mild confusion and muscle cramping to, in more severe and uncommon cases, heart rhythm disturbances and seizures. This is exactly why heart failure patients on diuretics are so often given a specific daily fluid target by their doctor, rather than being told to simply drink plenty of water the way the general population is. For this particular group, more water is not automatically safer, and the right amount is genuinely a number worth getting from your own doctor rather than a general guideline pulled from a wellness magazine. Consider someone like Eleanor, call her that, another composite, this time built from the kind of case more specific to heart failure management. 78 years old, living with mild heart failure for several years, taking a diuretic that had her feeling stable and well managed. Like many people told repeatedly to stay hydrated as a blanket health rule, Eleanor made a point of drinking a large bottle of water with most meals and another before bed, on top of coffee and the occasional glass of iced tea, without ever connecting that habit to her diuretic prescription or her low-sodium diet specifically. Over a period of weeks, she began feeling unusually foggy, occasionally forgetting words mid-sentence, and chalked it up to simply getting older. A routine blood panel, ordered by her cardiologist, caught mildly low sodium before it became anything more serious, and the fix wasn't dramatic. A specific daily fluid target discussed directly with her doctor, rather than the vague, drink plenty of water advice she'd absorbed from decades of general health messaging, never written with someone on her specific medication in mind. The fifth piece worth naming directly is the habit of drinking a large volume of water on a completely empty stomach, especially first thing in the morning, which is one of the most common versions of this entire pattern. Overnight, you go 6 to 8 hours without any fluid intake at all, and a long-standing piece of wellness advice tells people to rehydrate immediately with a large glass of water before anything else. The research we've covered suggests a more nuanced approach. That same large volume, consumed quickly on a stomach that's had nothing in it for hours, is essentially the textbook setup for triggering the strongest version of the pressor response, concentrated volume, often colder than room temperature straight from the refrigerator, hitting an empty stomach with no food to slow absorption. None of this means skipping morning hydration. It means the same total amount of water, taken as 2 or 3 smaller glasses across the first hour of your morning, rather than one large glass in 60 seconds, accomplishes the same hydration goal while asking far less of your cardiovascular system in the process. There's a sixth piece worth mentioning specifically because it combines 2 of the factors we've already covered into one extremely common scenario: drinking a large, cold glass of water immediately after exercise or yard work, while you're still flushed, slightly out of breath, and your body is already managing a separate set of cardiovascular adjustments from the activity itself. Researchers haven't specifically isolated this exact combination in a dedicated study the way they have plain water drinking at rest, but the underlying logic follows directly from everything we've covered. Your cardiovascular system, immediately post-exercise, is already busy redirecting blood flow, regulating heart rate, and managing its own recovery-related sympathetic activity. Layering a large, cold, rapidly consumed glass of water directly on top of that, rather than smaller sips during and after the activity, which is what most sports medicine guidance has actually recommended for years for entirely separate reasons, asks your nervous system to manage 2 overlapping demands at once instead of 1 at a time. The practical fix is the same one that's run through this entire video: smaller amounts more frequently, rather than saving up your hydration for one large glass after the fact. Now here's the line that matters most in this entire video. For the average person over 65, without heart failure, without a diuretic prescription, and without a diagnosed autonomic condition, an occasional quickly gulped glass of cold water is not dangerous, and this video is not a reason to fear your water bottle or to stop drinking enough fluid out of caution. Underhydration carries its own real risks, including dizziness, falls, constipation, and kidney strain, and avoiding water altogether to dodge a temporary blood pressure bump would trade one problem for a worse one. What is genuinely worth a direct conversation with your doctor, and not something to simply adjust on your own, is any of the following. If you're currently on a diuretic and have noticed new confusion, unusual muscle cramping, persistent nausea, or a headache that doesn't resolve with rest, If you have diagnosed heart failure and haven't been given a specific daily fluid target by your cardiologist, if you've noticed dizziness, a pounding sensation, or lightheadedness specifically in the 30 minutes after drinking a large glass of water, or if you have a diagnosed autonomic condition, where this exact reflex is dramatically stronger and is sometimes even used therapeutically under medical supervision to treat low blood pressure on standing, as we just discussed. None of these scenarios are emergencies in themselves, and none of them mean you've done something wrong by drinking water the way most people always have. But every one of them deserves a specific, named conversation with your doctor at your next visit. Framed clearly, I drink water quickly, in large amounts, and I'm on a diuretic should my routine change, rather than left as a vague background worry or quietly self-managed by guessing. So here's why all of this actually matters. When you put the 6 pieces together, none of this is an argument against water. Your body needs it, your kidneys need it, and dehydration in older adults is a well-documented serious risk in its own right, responsible for its own share of hospital visits, confusion, and falls. What the research actually points to is something more precise and more useful than a blanket warning. It's specifically the combination of large volume, fast pace, cold temperature, and an empty stomach, frequently all 4 at once, which is exactly the pattern most people default to without ever thinking about it, whether at the kitchen sink first thing in the morning or straight from the refrigerator after yard work. That triggers the strongest version of a reflex your nervous system handles very differently than it did when you were 30. Spread the same total amount of water across the day, in smaller, more frequent amounts, closer to room temperature, and the underlying biology barely registers it at all. This isn't a complicated fix requiring new equipment, an app, or a single dollar spent. It's a pacing change, applied to something you were already doing dozens of times a week regardless. Tonight, or starting tomorrow morning, the plan is simple and doesn't require buying anything or tracking a single number. Instead of 1 or 2 large glasses of water at widely spaced intervals, aim for smaller amounts more often, a few ounces every hour or two, rather than a full glass in one sitting, whether that's at your kitchen counter, your desk, or wherever you naturally spend your day. Let your morning water sit out for a few minutes before drinking it. Or keep a glass at room temperature on the counter overnight, rather than reaching straight for the refrigerator, particularly if you're prone to morning dizziness or you take blood pressure medication. If you take a diuretic, this is the week to actually ask your doctor or pharmacist what your specific daily fluid and sodium targets should be, rather than relying on general 8 glasses a day advice that wasn't written with your medication in mind at all. And if you've ever felt a little lightheaded, noticed your heart rate change, or simply felt off in the 30 minutes after a big glass of cold water, you now know there's a real, named, well-studied reason why, and a simple, free adjustment that addresses it directly without giving up a single ounce of the water your body genuinely needs. Before you go, be honest. Are you a sipper or a gulper? Tell me below, and tell me if this is the first time you're hearing that there's an actual physiological difference between the two, because for most people watching, it genuinely is. None of this is meant to make you anxious about something you've done your entire life without a second thought. It's meant to hand you one small, free, evidence-backed adjustment to a habit you are already doing dozens of times a week, regardless. And if you want to understand exactly how much water you actually need after 65, because the old 8 glasses a day rule everyone grew up hearing was never actually built with your body, your medications, or your kidneys specifically in mind, that's exactly what we're covering in the next video. I'll see you there.